The morning sun rose slow over the open plains, casting long golden light across the dusty fields. Wind brushed against the dry grass, carrying with it the faint creak of an old windmill and the faraway cry of a hawk. It was the kind of morning that made a man believe the world was still honest, even when he knew it wasn't. The cowboy leaned against the rail of his weathered fence, hat low over his eyes, watching the horizon where the stagecoach was coming down the road. He had no idea that this morning would change his quiet life forever. The coach rumbled closer, wheels kicking up a storm of dust as the horses fought against the rocky trail. The driver cracked the reins and shouted, while a single passenger sat stiffly inside, hands folded tight in her lap. She had come a long way, halfway across the country on a promise written in a letter. The man who'd written it had told her about his fine land, his gentle nature, and the future he wanted to build. She had believed every word, but she didn't know she was riding toward heartbreak, not a home. The cowboy's neighbor had been boasting for weeks about the bride he had ordered from back east. Said she was well-mannered, decent, and just the kind of woman to civilize a man's house. Folks around the settlement talked about it plenty. Some laughed at the idea of a man buying love through letters. Others said it was the only way for lonely souls on the frontier to find someone to share the silence with. But no one expected what would happen when she actually arrived. The coach stopped in front of the neighbor's yard. The woman stepped out carefully, boots sinking slightly into the dry dirt. She wore a long traveling dress, once fine but now wrinkled from the journey. Her hair was pinned up neatly, though a few strands had slipped loose in the wind. She looked around, expecting to see the man who had promised her a new life. But no one came. The neighbor stood on his porch, arms crossed, face hard as stone. Without a word of welcome, he turned his back and went inside. The driver tipped his hat, muttered something under his breath, and took off again, leaving her standing there with her suitcase and her fading hope. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she sat down on the wooden crate near the fence, her hands trembling as she looked out across the open land that suddenly didn't feel like opportunity anymore. It felt like a trap. From his own ranch next door, the cowboy had seen it all. He watched her get off that coach, watched the man turn away, and something in his chest twisted tight. He didn't know her, but he knew the look in her eyes. It was the same one his mother had the day his father never came home from the war. Loss had a way of showing itself, even on the faces of strangers. He told himself to stay out of it. It wasn't his business what another man did, and the frontier had its own rough ways. But when he saw her still sitting there an hour later, the sun beating down on her shoulders, he couldn't stand by any longer. He saddled his horse and rode down the trail between their lands. When he reached her, she looked up slowly. Her face was pale, her lips dry, and her eyes carried a tired kind of dignity, like someone trying not to break. "Ma'am," he said softly, tipping his hat. "You been waiting long?" She tried to smile, but her voice wavered as she answered. He changed his mind. The cowboy glanced toward the neighbor's house. The door was shut, the curtains drawn. "You got a place to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I sold everything I had to come here." He looked down at the dusty ground, thinking. The code of the plains was simple. You didn't leave someone stranded, no matter who they were. "You can rest up at my place till you figure things out," he offered. For a moment she hesitated, as though pride held her back. Then she nodded faintly. He picked up her suitcase, set it across his saddle, and helped her mount up behind him. The touch of her hand on his arm was light, uncertain. He rode slow back toward his ranch, trying not to think about how the soft sound of her breathing against his back made the wide silence of the prairie feel different. When they reached his cabin, he helped her down and led her inside. The place was modest, just one room, a stone hearth, and a wooden table, but it was clean and warm. He poured her some water and watched her take small sips, her hands still trembling. She thanked him softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't ask her name right away. Somehow it felt wrong, as if naming her would make her burden heavier. Instead, he went about lighting the fire, pretending not to notice the way she stared at the flames like she hadn't seen warmth in weeks. He offered her a plate of bread and stew, and she ate slowly, with the careful manners of someone raised better than the life she'd fallen into. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the quiet between them grew deep. He found himself wondering who she was before this, what kind of life she'd left behind, and what kind of man would abandon her in the middle of nowhere. Something about her silence spoke louder than any story could. Later that night, when the wind picked up and the fire crackled low, she finally spoke. "I thought I was coming to build a home," she said. "I thought I'd found a man who needed me as much as I needed him." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady now. Turns out he just wanted to prove something, to himself maybe, not to me. The cowboy nodded, unsure what to say. He'd seen men like that before, lonely but proud, making promises they never meant to keep. Not all men out here are like him, he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. I know, she whispered. Outside, coyotes called across the valley. The moon rose pale and distant, casting silver light across the plains. She slept by the fire, her head resting on her arms. He sat in his chair, watching the shadows dance across the walls. And for the first time in a long while, the sound of another person's breathing filled his home. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether she'd stay, whether the town would talk, or whether her past would find her again. But deep down, he felt something stirring, a quiet sense that life had just handed him something rare. Not love, not yet, but the kind of beginning that only comes once. Morning would bring questions, maybe trouble. The neighbor might come storming over, or the town gossip might spread faster than the wind. But as dawn broke again, painting the sky in soft gold, he stepped outside and saw her standing on the porch, wrapped in his old blanket, looking out across the fields with calm eyes. He realized then that he didn't just take in a stranger. He'd taken in a story that hadn't finished yet, and somewhere between the broken promise she carried and the quiet hope that grew in his chest, their paths were bound to change forever. But that change hadn't come yet. The sound of hooves in the distance broke the calm, the kind that carried dust, questions, and maybe danger. The cowboy turned toward the road, jaw tightening. The woman stepped back into the doorway, eyes wide. As the riders came closer, whatever peace they'd found in that short night was about to be tested. The riders came fast, their horses kicking up a trail of dust that shimmered in the morning light. The cowboy stood still by the fence, one hand resting on the worn handle of his rifle. He didn't raise it, not yet. He knew trouble when he saw it, and he had a feeling this was the kind that carried more words than bullets, at least for now. The woman stood behind him, clutching the blanket close around her shoulders, her eyes following the approaching figures with quiet fear. When the riders pulled up, their horses snorting and pawing the dirt, he recognized two of them from town. The third one, though, he didn't know. That man sat tall in the saddle, wearing a black coat despite the heat, his face sharp and unreadable. Morning, the cowboy said evenly. The stranger looked him over, then glanced toward the porch where the woman stood. I hear you took in someone that ain't yours, he said in a low voice. The cowboy met his eyes without flinching. She was left stranded, he answered. I wasn't about to let her freeze or starve out here. The stranger's mouth curved slightly, but there was no kindness in it. That's noble, he said, but some men might see it different. That woman belongs to someone who paid for her passage. The woman stepped forward a little, her voice trembling. He doesn't own me, she said. He turned his back on me. The stranger's gaze lingered on her, then he tipped his hat. I'm not here to argue, ma'am. I'm just saying folks talk. You might want to think twice about where you lay your head. With that, he turned his horse and rode off, his men following close behind. The sound of hooves faded into the wind, but the tension they left behind stayed heavy in the air. The cowboy turned to her. You know him? He asked. She shook her head slowly. No, but I think he knows the man who sent for me. Her voice cracked slightly, and she turned away, staring out toward the hills. He promised me a home, she said quietly. Said he had land, cattle, and a good heart. He wrote about wanting a wife to share the work, to share the silence of this land. I believed him, he nodded. A lot of folks out here hide behind words, he said. Letters don't show a man's true face. She looked down at her hands. He stopped writing a month before I came. I thought maybe the mail got lost. But when I stepped off that stagecoach and saw his eyes, I knew. He didn't want me anymore. The cowboy leaned against the fence, looking toward the horizon. You got family back east? She shook her head. My father passed last winter. I worked in a tailor's shop after that, but it wasn't enough to keep the room I was renting. When I saw his ad in the paper, I thought maybe it was a chance to start over, a chance to belong somewhere. Her words hung in the air, soft but full of pain. He could hear the truth in them, the kind of loneliness that made people take risks. He'd felt it himself too many nights, staring into the fire with nothing but the sound of the wind for company. Out here, loneliness could drive a person to do foolish things. Over the next few days, she helped around the cabin. She mended torn shirts, cooked simple meals, and swept the porch even when the dust returned 5 minutes later. The cowboy noticed the way she carried herself, with quiet strength, like someone trying not to take up too much space. She never asked for anything, but she thanked him for every small kindness. The town, however, wasn't as kind. By the end of the week, whispers started drifting through the settlement. Folks at the general store said the cowboy had stolen another man's bride. The black-coated stranger was seen talking with the neighbor who'd abandoned her. Some said they were planning to report him to the sheriff. Others said they might handle things their own way. Out here, justice wasn't always written on paper. One evening, while the sky burned orange and purple over the plains, the cowboy came in from tending the horses and found her sitting by the window, staring at a folded letter in her lap. "That from him?" he asked. She nodded. "I kept it," she said softly. "The last one he sent. I read it sometimes to remind myself that once someone wanted me." She hesitated, then added, "But I can't tell anymore if those words were ever true." He sat down across from her, the chair creaking under his weight. "You don't owe him a thing," he said firmly. "Not his memory, not his promise." She looked up at him, eyes glistening in the firelight. "Then why does it still hurt?" she whispered. He didn't have an answer for that. Pain didn't always follow reason. It just lingered, like the dust that never settled on the plains. Instead of speaking, he stood and tossed another log on the fire. The crackle filled the silence between them, and for a while it felt like the flames were talking in their place. Days turned into weeks. She began tending a small garden near the porch, planting seeds she'd found in an old tin box. He'd watch her sometimes from the corral, the way she knelt in the dirt with gentle hands, humming softly under her breath. It reminded him of how things used to be before the wars, before the land grew wild and hearts turned hard. But peace didn't last long in those parts. One afternoon, as he was mending a fence post, he saw dust rising again down the road, the same way it had that first morning. He set his tools aside and narrowed his eyes. This time, only one rider approached, and it was the neighbor himself. The man reined in his horse and dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the dry earth. "You've got something that belongs to me," he said coldly. The cowboy stood straight, wiping the dirt from his hands. "She don't belong to anyone but herself," he replied. The neighbor sneered. "She was supposed to be my wife. I sent for her. I paid for her fare. She was mine to choose." His tone was sharp, but underneath it was something else. Shame, maybe, or the bitterness of pride gone sour. The cowboy didn't move. "You had your chance," he said evenly. "You left her standing in the dirt like she was nothing. That's on you." The man's eyes darkened. "You think you're some kind of hero?" He spat. "You take her in, feed her, and suddenly she's yours. Folks are already talking. They say you've been keeping her here for yourself." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Say what they want." "I did what was right." The neighbor stepped closer, his hand hovering near his belt. "You'll regret that," he muttered. "This land's got rules, and one of them is knowing what's yours and what ain't." Without waiting for a reply, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving the air thick with tension. The cowboy watched him go, knowing this wasn't over. The kind of man who could abandon a woman and still claim ownership wasn't one to let go quietly. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and moaning through the cracks in the walls. She sat by the fire again, but this time her hands were clenched tight in her lap. "He came here, didn't he?" she asked. The cowboy nodded. "He won't let it go," she said, voice low. "He's the kind of man who needs to win even when he's wrong." He met her eyes. "Then he'll have to go through me first." She looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to the fire. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles," she whispered. "You've already done enough." But he didn't answer because deep down, he knew it wasn't about duty anymore. It was something else, something that had taken root quietly, like her garden outside. As the night wore on, the sound of distant thunder rolled across the plains. The storm was still far off, but it was coming. The cowboy sat by the window, watching the horizon light up in flashes, and he couldn't shake the feeling that before the rain ever reached them, there'd be another kind of storm waiting to break. Somewhere out there, in the dark between the lightning strikes, a lone rider was moving fast, back toward their land, back toward unfinished business. And neither of them knew it yet, but the next dawn would bring more than wind and rain. It would bring a reckoning. The storm arrived before dawn, hard and sure, drumming the roof like 1,000 small fists. The cowboy was already up, pulling on his boots, when a fist of a different kind hit the door. He opened it to find the black-coated stranger again, hat dripping rain, jaw set tight. Behind him stood the neighbor, eyes red from no sleep or too much whiskey. The stranger spoke first. He said the sheriff wanted a word at daybreak. Then he added that words had a way of turning into verdicts out here, and verdicts into trouble. The neighbor said nothing, only stared past the cowboy toward the glow of the hearth where she had just set a kettle to boil. They rode in together, 3 men sharing a road and not a single line of trust. The wind bent the cottonwoods along the creek. The town woke slow under a sky the color of iron. The sheriff waited under the awning of the jailhouse, coffee steaming in his hands. He was a quiet man with a limp gained long ago and a talent for weighing a room without saying much. He looked from the cowboy to the neighbor to the stranger. Then he asked the only question that mattered to folks who cared more for paper than for people. Was there a contract? The neighbor pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up like a badge. The stranger's eyes flicked to it, then to the sheriff's face, reading the ground the way a scout reads tracks. The cowboy did not look at the paper. He looked back at the street where the schoolhouse bell clanged thin in the rain, and where she stood with a shawl tight around her shoulders, having followed at a distance. The sheriff told them all to come inside and keep their tempers. He sat behind his desk and read the paper line by line. Passage paid. Intent to marry. A signature that carried little honor. A line that said either party could withdraw before vows were said. The sheriff set it down and took a slow breath. He said the law was a fence, not a noose. Then he said no man owned another. The neighbor protested, voice loud enough to be heard in the street. Words spilled out about money, about reputation, about a woman owed. The sheriff's jaw tensed. He said a woman was not a horse and this office was not an auction pen. The stranger, still silent, watched the cowboy. Finally, the sheriff asked her to step inside and speak for herself. She did, standing near the door like someone ready to run if the room turned cruel. Her voice did not shake. She said she had arrived on a promise, and that promise had been broken in full daylight. She said kindness had lifted her from the dust and given her bread and a bed near a warm fire. She said she would work, pay back what passage cost, and owe no man a debt she did not choose. The sheriff nodded. He ruled simple. No one would take her anywhere she did not want to go. If the neighbor wanted money back, he could file a claim as if he had paid for freight lost in the road. If he wished to argue further, he could speak to a judge 2 counties over when the spring circuit came through. Until then, no taking, no threats, no visits after dark. The neighbor swore under his breath. The stranger gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. The cowboy tipped his hat to the sheriff and led her back into the rain. That should have been the end of it, or at least a pause. But out here, rulings were often invitations for men to find other ways. By noon, the saloon carried the tale like wildfire. The general store did the same. The sewing circle that met in the back of the church took her in, though 2 of the older ladies made faces that said pity on the surface and judgment underneath. She joined them anyway, hands steady as she mended a pile of shirts for farmhands who never bothered to sew a button. Her needle moved like a small bird, quick and sure. The pastor's wife asked if she would teach the little ones their letters on Saturday. She agreed and smiled for the first time in days. Back at the ranch, the main conflict began to show its deeper roots. The neighbor's land backed up to the same creek the cowboy used to water his cattle. That creek had been running low since late summer. The neighbor had cut a narrow trench to pull more water to his side, a thing that was not illegal unless done in the dark and widened by shovel after shovel. The cowboy had noticed the decline in his troughs and the thirsty look on his herd. He had not said anything yet. He did now. He rode the fence line at dusk and followed the creek to where the mud showed boot prints, and the cut drew a thin silver tongue away from the natural bend. He stood there a long time, rain dripping from his hat, and understood that the fight over a woman had given cover to a fight about water, which out here was the same as fighting about life itself. He set a flagged stake in the bank just above the cut. Then he rode home and told her what he had found. She listened with the same stillness she used when sewing. She said if he needed someone to speak to the town, she would. He shook his head. He said there were some things men needed to handle so the wind did not start saying a woman put him up to it. The black-coated stranger had his own subplot. He turned out to be an agent of sorts, a collector for a syndicate that bought cheap land from men who lost their crops and their nerve. He visited the neighbor more than once, and once he came to the cowboy's porch and stood with his boots leaving clean rectangles in the wind-washed dust. He said the times were changing. He said rail lines would make the town bigger and the land dearer. He said men who held water would hold fortunes. Then he asked if the cowboy wanted to sell now and avoid trouble later. The cowboy answered by closing the door. She had a subplot too, though she did not call it that. She began to make a little money with her needle, mending for hands and hemming dresses for girls who had only one Sunday outfit. She traded work for eggs and flour when folks were tight. She taught letters at the school on Saturdays, and the children lined up to show her their copybooks. The smallest girl drew a picture of a cabin by a creek and a woman by a garden, with a man and a horse nearby. The girl handed it over, shy and proud. She paid the child with a ribbon snipped from the hem of her own shawl and kept the picture pinned by the window. When the cowboy came in from the fields and saw it, something tender and dangerous moved in him at the same time. The gossip did not stop. A ranch hand from the neighbor's place made a habit of riding by the cabin just before dusk. He would tip his hat and grin, the kind of grin a man wears when he wants to pick a fight without using fists. One night, 3 of them rode by together and whooped at the sky as if it were a fairground. The cowboy stood on the porch, arms crossed, saying nothing. She stayed inside and fed the fire, face pale, back straight. The next morning, the chicken coop gate was found open and 2 birds gone. Tracks led toward the neighbor's south fence, then faded in the hard ground. The sheriff came by that afternoon and spoke quiet. He said he could not jail a man for grinning or for a gate that wind might have lifted. He said to keep calm but keep watch. Then he looked at the flagged stake the cowboy had brought back from the creek. He said he would ride that way soon, but he asked for patience. There were other troubles in the county. 2 brothers feuding over a mule, a claim jumper near the far ridge, a wandering man found frozen behind the livery who needed burying. The law stretched thin as rawhide in winter. The cowboy did what men do when words fail. He built. He fixed the back hinge on the barn. He set new posts along the north line. He strung wire until his fingers bled. She saw the state of his hands and wrapped them in linen with a salve she mixed from tallow and pine pitch. He winced once. She smiled once. They both pretended the air had not changed in the room. At church the next Sunday, the pastor spoke of vows and of promises kept when no one is watching. The neighbor stood in the back, hat in hand, eyes on the floor. When the hymn began, the black-coated stranger did not sing. He stepped outside and lit a thin cigar, smoke curling into the cold. After the last verse, the neighbor approached the pastor and said he wished to be forgiven by God but not by men. He said men had to understand what belonged to them. The pastor set a hand on his shoulder and said nothing else. The day after that, the cowboy found the flagged stake torn from the bank and tossed in the creek. The cut had widened, deep and fresh. He went to the sheriff with mud on his boots and anger in his chest. The sheriff sighed and asked for one day. He promised to bring a surveyor from a nearby ranch and measure the flow. The cowboy agreed and rode home with a weight that settled like a stone. That night, the wind died. The sky cleared and the stars looked close enough to touch. She sat on the step with a shawl around her shoulders and told him more of her past, not to win his pity, but to lay the truth on the table like plain bread. She said she had been betrothed once back east, to a clerk who spoke gently and counted coins like prayers. He died of fever in early spring. After that, she said, the city turned into a box with no lid and no windows. She came west for open air and honest work, not for rescue. She looked him in the eye and said she would leave rather than be the cause of a war between neighbors. He said he did not bring her in to send her away. He said he would not be run off his own creek. They were both still, listening to the cattle shift in the dark, when a soft clatter came from the barn. One bucket fell, then another. The cowboy rose, rifle in hand, and moved into the yard with steps that left no sound. She followed to the door and waited with her back to the jam. Breath held. He pushed the barn door wide and found a shadow near the tack wall. The shadow moved left, quick. He raised the rifle and called out steady, naming the trespasser without using a curse. The figure froze. A boy no older than 15 stepped forward, hat in his hands, eyes wide. He worked for the neighbor. He said he came to take nothing, only to warn. He said men were meeting at the far trough on the neighbor's land. Men with faces he did not know. Men who worked for the black-coated stranger and carried more iron than sense. The boy fled before the cowboy could ask more. When the cowboy came back to the porch, she stood there with a lantern that trembled just a little. He told her, and he watched the light in her eyes change from fear to resolve. She said they should go to the sheriff now, not in the morning. He nodded. Then he said they would saddle 2 horses and ride the long way through the cottonwoods where the creek hid their tracks. He said they would not pass by the neighbor's fence at all. Before they left, he took a small tin from the mantel and slipped it into his coat. Inside were the last coins he had, saved from a cattle sale late summer and meant for seed and fence wire. He handed the tin to her and told her to keep it in her pocket. She frowned and tried to hand it back. He closed her fingers around it and said a simple truth. If the night went wrong, she would need a way to leave and land on her feet. She stared at him, eyes bright, then tucked the tin away and pulled the shawl tight. They rode under a moon that looked like milk poured over the hills. The creek ran dark and low beside them. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, the murmur of men rose and fell like wasps in a jar. The sheriff's lantern flickered in the town square far ahead, small as a star. They moved with care, every hoofstep a choice. Halfway to the bend, the cowboy raised a hand and halted. Voices carried on the cold air. The black-coated stranger spoke of purchases and pressure. Another man laughed a thin laugh and said water finds its level the same way men do, with a push. The cowboy leaned close and whispered that they would not take the bend. They would cross the creek where the stones lay flat and ride the ridge, and from there they would have a clear line to the sheriff's door. She nodded, jaw set. They turned toward the shallows, but as they did, a match flared on the far bank and lit a face they both knew too well. The neighbor stepped from the brush with the match dying in his fingers and anger burning brighter behind his eyes. He called the cowboy by name and told him to come across and speak like men. The creek hummed low between them. The horses shifted. The wind fell still. And in that small, breathless pause, the stranger's men stood up from the cottonwoods one by one, their silhouettes cutting the moonlight, the ridge to town suddenly a long way off and full of eyes. The moon hung low, a thin white scar across the dark sky, lighting the creek just enough for the cowboy to see the silhouettes on the other side. The neighbor stood in front, shoulders tense, hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The black-coated stranger was half a step behind, his face unreadable but his presence heavy as the night itself. Around them, 5 men waited, their hats low and rifles glinting faintly in the pale light. The air felt sharp and hollow like the moment before thunder breaks. The cowboy didn't move. His horse shifted under him, sensing the tension. Behind him, she sat still, one hand gripping the saddle horn, the other clutching the small tin he had given her. Her breath came fast, though she tried to hide it. The creek between them looked calm, but he knew how quickly calm water could turn when something disturbed it. "Come across," the neighbor called. His voice carried over the water, steady but strained. "We can settle this here man to man," the cowboy's voice came low but firm. "This isn't the way. It's the only way left," the neighbor snapped. "You took what was mine. You tried to shame me in front of the whole town, and now you think you can take my water too." "I didn't take your water," the cowboy said, tightening his reins. "You dug the cut yourself. You know it." The stranger stepped forward. "No need for lies. The creek belongs to whoever holds it. The law out here is written by the men strong enough to keep what they claim." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Then I guess you'll have to test that theory." One of the men laughed quietly, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet of the plains. The woman's heart pounded so loud she thought they might hear it. She wanted to speak, to say something that could break the rising heat between them. But the look in the men's eyes told her that words would only feed the fire. The cowboy leaned close to her. "Ride if you have to," he whispered. "Follow the ridge to the east. Don't stop till you see the church steeple." She shook her head, gripping his sleeve. "I'm not leaving you." "Don't argue," he said softly, eyes still on the figures across the creek. "If this goes wrong, you ride. You hear me?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. The wind picked up, whistling through the grass. The black-coated stranger raised his hand slightly, and 2 of his men stepped forward. "We'll take the woman," he said coldly. "And the land. You can keep your pride, cowboy." The cowboy's rifle came up before the words even finished leaving the man's mouth. "You'll take neither," he said. "You cross this creek and you won't make it back." The men froze, waiting for a signal. The neighbor's eyes darted between them and the cowboy, his jaw twitching. He wasn't a killer by nature, but pride and anger had twisted something inside him. "This is your last warning," he said. "Give her up. Leave the land. No one has to get hurt." The cowboy didn't blink. Someone already did. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The creek murmured softly between them, the only sound in the vast stillness. Then lightning flashed in the far distance, illuminating the scene for a heartbeat. The men, the guns, the fear in her eyes. And then darkness swallowed it all again. The first gunshot broke the silence. It came from one of the stranger's men, a wild shot that cracked through the night and hit the water near the cowboy's horse. The animal reared and the woman clung tight to the saddle. Before the echo faded, the cowboy fired back, the sharp report splitting the air. One man fell to his knees on the opposite bank. Chaos followed. Horses screamed. Gunfire lit the darkness in flashes. The cowboy dismounted, pulling her down behind a fallen log near the creek. "Stay low," he said, reloading fast. She crouched beside him, clutching the tin with one hand and pressing the other against the earth to keep herself steady. Dirt sprayed as another bullet struck near her feet. Across the creek, the stranger shouted orders, his voice cutting through the storm of sound. "Push forward! Take the cabin! The cowboy fired again, dropping another man who had tried to wade through the shallow water. He knew he couldn't hold them all off forever, but he wasn't about to back down. Not after everything, not when she was behind him, trusting him with her life. The neighbor hesitated, watching the fight unfold, and for a split second, doubt flickered in his eyes. He hadn't wanted this, not really. He just wanted to feel like the world still owed him something. But now the stranger's men were fully committed, and he was caught between fear and pride. Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, the drops hissing as they struck the ground. The creek rose quickly, muddy water swirling around the stones. The cowboy pulled her closer to the bank, shouting over the roar. "When I say you run, I'm not leaving you," she said again, voice breaking. "You have to," he shouted back. "If I fall, someone has to tell the sheriff what happened." Another flash of lightning lit the scene, the neighbor struggling to reload, the stranger raising his pistol, the cowboy kneeling protectively beside her. Then thunder rolled deep and heavy, as if the sky itself was watching. The stranger took aim. "End this!" he yelled. Before he could fire, the neighbor stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Wait!" he shouted. "This isn't what I wanted." The stranger turned his pistol on him, eyes cold as the rain. "You wanted it the moment you called me." The cowboy saw it all happen in a blink. The flash, the shot, the neighbor stumbling backward, falling hard into the mud. She gasped and covered her mouth, tears mixing with the rain. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The stranger lowering his gun, the men hesitating, the sound of the creek roaring louder and louder. Then the cowboy's rifle barked once more, hitting the stranger square in the shoulder. He fell, clutching his arm, shouting orders through gritted teeth. "Fall back!" one of his men yelled, but the others weren't ready to give up. Two crossed the creek under fire, slipping on the slick rocks, firing as they came. The cowboy shoved her toward the horse. "Go!" he yelled. "Now!" She hesitated, torn between fear and love, but when another bullet tore through the air, she ran. The horse reared, startled, but she pulled herself into the saddle with trembling hands. The rain blurred everything, the world reduced to thunder, mud, and flashes of light. Behind her, the cowboy fought like a man born for the storm. His rifle cracked again and again, each shot cutting through the chaos. One man fell, then another, but the stranger's remaining hand raised a pistol, eyes full of rage, and aimed straight at the cowboy's chest. She turned in the saddle just in time to see the flash. The sound split her heart in two. The cowboy staggered but stayed standing, hand pressed against his side. He fired one last time, his shot sending the stranger spinning into the water. Then he fell to one knee, breath heavy, rain washing the blood from his shirt. She wanted to ride back, to reach him, but more riders were coming from the ridge, men from the town, drawn by the noise. She didn't know if they were friends or foes. She could only do what he told her. She turned the horse east and kicked hard, riding into the dark, tears burning her eyes as the wind whipped past. Behind her, the gunfire faded into the night, replaced by the sound of the storm tearing through the valley. The land that had once been quiet and kind was now a battlefield, and the man who had once stood alone on his porch, watching the sunrise, was fighting not just for her, but for the last bit of decency left in a lawless land. She rode until the church steeple appeared through the haze of rain. The bell hung silent, but light glowed faintly in the pastor's window. She stopped the horse and looked back once toward the direction of the creek. The thunder rolled again, deep and distant. She whispered a prayer into the night, her voice shaking. Somewhere out there he was still standing. Or he wasn't. She couldn't know. But the way the wind shifted, the way the rain slowed, she felt the land holding its breath, waiting to see how it all would end. And as she dismounted and ran toward the light, the sound of hooves in the distance told her the fight wasn't over yet. The storm had only begun to turn. The morning came gray and silent, the storm finally gone, leaving the plains washed clean. Mist hung over the low hills, and the creek ran heavy and dark, carrying away the broken branches and footprints from the night before. The church bell rang once, soft and hollow, as if the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. She stood on the steps, her dress soaked through, mud up to her knees, still waiting for word. Every sound of hooves in the distance made her heart leap, but each time it was only another ranch hand or a townsman riding past, heads down, faces grim. When the sheriff arrived, he carried more questions than answers. His horse was splattered with mud, and his hat hung low over tired eyes. He tied the reins to the post and stepped up the church steps where she waited. For a moment he said nothing, only nodded in quiet understanding. Then he told her what had happened by the creek. The neighbor had been found alive, wounded but breathing, taken by the townsman who came late to the fight. The stranger was gone, washed downstream or carried off by his own men, no one could say. The cowboy had been found near the fallen log where he'd made his stand. He was hurt, bad enough that most men wouldn't have made it through the night, but he was still alive when they pulled him out of the mud. She didn't ask permission to go. She only ran. The ride back felt longer than it ever had before, every bend in the road heavy with dread. The rain had left the world quiet, the sound of her horse's hooves dull against the wet earth. When she reached the cabin, the front door was open, lanterns glowing faintly inside. The townsman had laid him on the bed, his face pale, his breathing shallow but steady. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she brushed the damp hair from his forehead. His eyes fluttered open, faint but aware. When he saw her, a tired smile crossed his face. "You made it," he whispered. "I told you I wouldn't leave," she said, her voice breaking. He tried to speak again, but the pain caught him. She took his hand and held it tight, refusing to let go. The sheriff stepped forward quietly and said he'd done what few men would have dared, stood his ground when the rest ran. The town owed him more than a thanks. She stayed by his side through the long hours of that morning, changing bandages, spooning water between his lips, whispering words he might never remember but needed to hear. Outside, the sun finally began to rise, golden light spilling across the damp fields. The chickens began to stir, and the horses in the corral gave soft calls, as if life itself was returning to the ranch. Days passed before he could sit up. The doctor from town came twice, shaking his head at first, then smiling when he saw strength returning to the cowboy's face. Each night she read aloud from the small Bible left on the shelf, though her voice sometimes faltered when she reached the parts about forgiveness. He would listen quietly, watching the flames dance on the hearth, as if trying to make peace with things that couldn't be undone. The neighbor came once, limping from his own wound, hat in his hands. He didn't step inside right away, standing on the porch as if the threshold itself judged him. When she opened the door, he spoke softly without the bluster he once carried. He said he'd been wrong, about her, about the letters, about the things a man thinks he can own. He said he'd fill in the trench he'd cut at the creek and rebuild the fence line himself. Then he turned to the cowboy who sat propped up on the bed and said, "You saved my life when you didn't have to." The cowboy looked at him for a long time, then gave a faint nod. "Just seemed like the right thing to do," he said. The neighbor left without another word, leaving behind an envelope of money to pay for the doctor and supplies. She placed it on the table and didn't touch it for days. By the second week, the cowboy was strong enough to walk outside. He leaned on her arm as they stepped into the sunlight. The land looked different now. Greener somehow, the creek flowing full again. The air carried that clean smell only rain can leave behind. She guided him to the porch, and they stood there, neither speaking. The silence between them no longer carried fear or sorrow. It carried peace. He turned to her finally, voice rough but steady. "You could have gone back east," he said. "Started over somewhere else." She looked out over the fields. "I did start over," she said. "Right here." He smiled at that, a quiet, grateful smile that said more than words ever could. The wind moved through the tall grass, bending it in waves like the sea. For the first time in years, he felt like the land was listening, not waiting to test him, not holding its breath for the next storm, but simply alive around him. The sheriff came by once more before summer. He brought news that the stranger's body had never been found. Some said he'd drowned in the creek, others claimed he'd crossed into the desert and vanished. The sheriff shrugged and said that kind of man never stays still long enough to die where he's supposed to. The cowboy just nodded. "If he's out there," he said, "he knows where to find me." But the months rolled by and no trouble came. The town quieted. People who had whispered before now nodded kindly when she walked by. The children from the school still came on Saturdays, their laughter ringing through the cabin yard. The garden she'd planted bloomed wider each week, full of bright flowers and vegetables strong enough to survive the dry winds. One evening, as the sun set in deep shades of orange and red, she stood by the fence, watching the light spread across the open land. The cowboy joined her, the limp in his step still there but softer now. He leaned against the post beside her and said, "Funny thing about this land. It tries to break you before it lets you belong." She smiled. "Maybe that's how it knows who deserves it." They stood together in silence, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the hills. The sound of the windmill creaked softly in the distance. Somewhere down by the creek a frog croaked, and the world felt whole again. Later that night, when the fire burned low, he took her hand. "You stayed when no one else would have," he said. "You saved me as much as I saved you." She looked at him with quiet eyes. "We saved each other," she said. The words settled between them like the warmth of the fire, and neither spoke again for a long time. The only sound was the wind outside and the steady crackle of the flames. By the time autumn came, the ranch looked alive again. The herd had grown strong, the fences stood straight, and the cabin had new boards where the storm had once torn it. Travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop for water and hear the story, how a cowboy once took in a woman left behind and how both had found something. Neither expected to find out there in the middle of nowhere a home. They didn't call it love right away. Out here, words like that took time. But every sunrise they shared, every chore done side by side, every quiet evening spent by the fire made the truth clear without needing to be spoken. The past didn't vanish. It lingered in the scars on his body, in the look in her eyes when thunder rolled across the plains. But they'd learned something the hard way, that even on land built by hardship and silence, kindness could grow. And sometimes the people who arrive by accident are the ones meant to stay. As winter settled over the valley, snow dusted the fence rails, and smoke curled from the chimney. The cowboy sat by the fire, carving a small wooden figure while she read aloud from the same Bible that had once filled their nights with prayers. When she looked up, he was smiling, the kind of smile that said he'd made peace with everything that came before. Outside, the wind blew cold across the plains, but inside the little cabin, it was warm, the kind of warmth that doesn't come from firewood alone. It came from two hearts that had weathered the storm and found each other when the world seemed empty. And though the land would always test them, they knew they'd stand together through whatever came next. In a country that measured life by dust and distance, they had found something worth holding on to. Not just survival, but belonging. Not just a promise, but a home built on trust, courage, and a love that grew out of the simplest act a man could ever do, choosing to help someone who had no one else. And long after the seasons changed, and the creek ran steady again, folks still spoke of that story. The cowboy who saw his neighbor abandon a mail-order bride and took her in, only to discover that sometimes the heart finds its way not through fate or chance, but through doing what's right when no one's watching.